So, the story of the explorers who discovered the bluebuck living in an isolated pocket of South Africa and then almost immediately watched one of the rarest species in existence be plunged into extinction is one of the most haunting and brutal examples of how quickly the natural world can be gone in a blink. The bluebuck was one of the rarest animals on the entire planet during the American Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. And because the European world was consumed by war and expansion throughout the 1700s, the short recorded existence of the bluebuck was swallowed up and overshadowed throughout history to the point that most people today have never even heard of this creature. It stood about 4 feet tall at the shoulder and was built like a small horse. Its coat is described as a strange shimmering bluish gray color, almost silver blue in the sunlight, with a bright white patch just in front of each eye. It had long, curved black horns that ringed backwards like a corkscrew. It looked like nothing else on the African continent and lived nowhere else on the planet except a narrow strip of grassland squeezed between a small few towns in southern Africa. That tiny range is exactly what made it so vulnerable, and exactly why it's the first large African mammal to be driven to extinction by humans in recorded history. My name's Luke, I have a degree in anthropology, and I made this series in collaboration with Colossal Biosciences, who also made a video covering the extinction and the de-extinction of the bluebuck. It's a great video, and if you like this one, well then you have to check theirs out too. And this is Extinctions Through Time. So to understand how the bluebuck was first scientifically recorded and then quickly driven to extinction, you have to go back to the year 1652, when the Dutch East India Company set up a small supply station at the very southern tip of Africa called the Cape of Good Hope. It wasn't meant to be a colony at first, it was just a rest stop for ships heading to Asia along the spice trade routes. But slowly, over the course of decades, Dutch farmers began pushing northward into the wilderness from that little station, further and further into the countryside, looking for land to graze their cattle and sheep on. And as they pushed northeast, they started running into animals that no European had ever written about before. And one of those animals was the bluebuck. The first written account of the bluebuck came from a German traveler named Peter Kolb in 1719. He'd mistaken the blue antelope for a goat, but documented that the blue goats are shaped like the tame, but are as large as the European hart. Their hair is very short and of a delicate blue, but the color fades when they are killed to a bluish gray. Their legs are long but not out of proportion. Their flesh is well tasted but rarely fat. And they are rarely killed but for the sake of their skins, which are as good as those of a deer. Their flesh is generally given to the hogs. But it would take another 50 years before European explorers would push farther into the interior to actually watch this animal living in the wild and write down what they'd seen. One of those explorers was a young Swedish man named Anders Sparman. He arrived at the Cape of Good Hope in 1772, sent there originally just to tutor a local family's children, but his real passion was collecting plants and animals that nobody in Europe had ever seen or studied before. They set off with a small group, riding wagons pulled by oxen deep into the southeast African countryside, hunting hippos and lions along the rivers, and documenting every single strange new creature and plant that they came across. In his own published journal from that expedition, he described encountering the bluebuck and became one of the very few European explorers to actually see the living animal with their own eyes. The most vivid first-hand description of the bluebuck alive in the wild comes from a Frenchman named Lavaillon, who grew up collecting birds and insects in the forests of South America. In 1781, he sailed to the Cape of Good Hope and spent years pushing up deep into the unmapped territory with local hunters as his guides. In his own published account of that journey, he described one specific moment out in the wilderness when a hunter that was with him suddenly stopped walking and called out to him. My hunter, stopping all of a sudden, called out to me that he perceived a bluebuck. I had never seen this animal, which is the most curious and beautiful species of antelope that Africa produces. I quickly dismounted from my horse and advanced towards it with precaution, taking advantage of every bush that could serve to screen me from its view. Because my precautions were unnecessary, it stood looking at me without the least appearance of fear, and did not offer to move till I was within 70 paces of it. I then fired and it fell. This antelope has been described by Pennant under the name of the blue antelope, antelope. It is one of the scarcest animals in Africa. It is only to be found in the neighborhood of Zwellendam, and even there, very rarely. It is about the size of a large stag. Its head is small and beautifully shaped. Its horns, which are 2 feet in length, are very straight and run curiously up in rings till within a little of the point. The color of this animal is a fine blue, but this color changes to a bluish gray as soon as it's dead. The hair is very short and the skin beneath is extremely thin. Its legs are long but well proportioned. Its flesh is well tasted, though rarely fat. The inhabitants of the Cape rarely kill it, but for the sake of its skin, which is as good as that of a deer. I took care to preserve the skin of one I had killed, and it is now in my collection. He noted that other scientists back in Europe had already given the animal 2 completely different names without ever agreeing on what to call it, which really gives us an idea of just how few people had ever actually seen this animal alive, and that there definitely were other European explorers who had ventured down into these South African wilds and had seen this blue antelope, although any of those records, had they ever existed, are lost to us today. That said, most researchers in Europe were only writing about the bluebuck from secondhand descriptions and old preserved skins of bluebucks that had been killed and their skins taken back to Europe, which doesn't really give you an accurate picture of the animal. It's a bit like attempting to reconstruct a species based on their skeleton. I mean, just try to reconstruct a hippo based on its skeleton. It's not going to go well. Lavallon was one of the only people alive that we know of who could say that he'd actually seen a living, breathing bluebuck. Now, this sounds like a weird thing to say, but it's true that the bluebuck was not only a rare animal while it was alive, but it was also rare in its extinction. And I'll tell you why. We used to know so little about the real bluebuck that it was only until genetic testing became available that modern scientists realized that some of the bluebuck specimens that were brought back to Europe in the 1700s weren't even bluebucks at all. But by the time these written accounts were being published back in Europe in the early 1800s and more people were hearing about this animal, it had already vanished. Unlike a lot of large animals that could retreat deeper into the untouched wilderness to escape hunters and farmers, the bluebuck's entire world was already small to begin with. It lived only in a small, narrow strip of grassland in southern Africa, and as Dutch farmers kept expanding their cattle and sheep herds across that same land, there was less and less room left for the wild bluebuck to survive. And because the hunters saw them as competitors for the livestock, they hunted the bluebuck in droves and shot them for meat and sport, as European collectors were willing to pay high prices for a rare and unusual African trophy that nobody else back home owned. In the late 1700s, the bluebuck was the rarest large animal on Earth. Estimates are that only 300 to 400 existed in the wild when Europeans really came to live in the area around 1766, and over the next 34 years, they would displace and shoot every last bluebuck all the way to extinction. And the last confirmed sighting of the wild bluebuck happened somewhere around the year 1799 or possibly as late as 1800 in a district called Swellendam. That means the entire span of time between the very first written mention of the bluebuck in 1719 and its complete disappearance from the wild was only about 80 years. And a German traveler named Martin Lichtenstein is credited with obtaining the very last confirmed specimen of the species around that time, closing the book forever on an animal that most people in the world had barely even had the chance to learn existed in the first place. When the bluebuck was first sighted by Europeans in 1719, Europe was still recovering from a massive war over who would control the Spanish throne, and the American colonies were still tiny, with the Revolutionary War being nearly a lifetime in the future. America was still only made up of scattered settlements clinging to the Atlantic coastline. By the time Anders Sparrman was riding through the grasslands of the Cape of Good Hope in the 1770s, hunting hippos and lions, and finally documenting the bluebuck, the American colonies were in the middle of an open revolt against the King of England, and the Declaration of Independence was signed just a few years later. All of this happening on the complete opposite side of the planet. And by the time the last bluebuck was killed around 1799 or 1800, Napoleon was seizing control of France, George Washington had just died, and the British were only a handful of years away from conquering the entire Cape Colony of South Africa. While the world of the mid to late 1700s was caught up in continent-spanning wars, revolutions, and the bloody emergence of entirely new nations, a small, isolated species of antelope at the very bottom of Africa's wilderness were quietly being wiped from existence with almost nobody around to notice. But now, more than 200 years later, Colossal Biosciences is setting out to rewrite the ending of this story. Colossal made rounds recently when they announced the bluebuck as their 6th key species in an ongoing effort to effectively bring back species from extinction, joining other projects like the woolly mammoth, the dodo, the direwolf, the South Island giant moa, and the thylacine. To do this, their scientists took genetic material of one of the few real preserved bluebuck specimens housed in a museum in Sweden and used it to build one of the most detailed genetic blueprints ever created for an extinct animal. Colossal has said that African antelope species have been almost completely ignored by conservation efforts around the world, even though more than 25% of every antelope species today is currently declining and at risk of disappearing the exact same way that the bluebuck did. The hope is that the tools and techniques they developed through this project, and especially new methods for retrieving eggs from an antelope, can also be used to help protect the antelope that are barely hanging on in the wild. Now, I find these particular stories to be so fascinating. Through these early historic accounts from explorers, we get a glimpse into a small, tiny, and vanishing world that was gone shortly after it was first officially noticed. And those accounts of the few people who saw that world with their own eyes, looking at something living on the very edge of existence, it's profound, and it calls on us to again ask this lingering question. What do we owe to a species whose extinction we directly caused when some 200 years later, we now have the means to offer this extinct species a new chapter in our world? And of all the things that modern humans find themselves doing, well, I can hardly think of anything more important than preserving and, when we can, bringing back parts of our lost worlds. My name's Luke, and I made this series in collaboration with Colossal Biosciences to tell the story of the extinction and the de-extinction and the human history between them of the direwolf, the woolly mammoth, the dodo, the South Island giant moa, the thylacine, and the bluebuck. And this has been Extinctions Through Time.